Hi, everybody. Today we are joined by some social work students who are going to help us really pull out some of the key themes and thoughts, perspective of how COVID-19 has impacted young people in Newfoundland and Labrador. And so this conversation is really stemming out of the release of a policy brief called We Can't Go Back to Normal, Building a Better Future for Youth and Young Families in Newfoundland and Labrador. And that policy brief was co-created by multiple members of the Vulnerable Youth and Young Families Working Group, who represent several community agencies and thousands of young people across our province. So today, so excited to be joined by Sarah Lush, Rebecca Dooley, Hannah Evely, and Bridgette Burry, who are all second-year social work students with Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. And today we're going to pick their brains a little bit on, how has COVID-19 impacted them as students, but also what are some of the broader shifts that they're seeing, themes that they're seeing from their peers, their colleagues, but also just young people more generally from a social work student perspective. So thanks so much, folks, for joining us here this afternoon. Really excited for this conversation. And we're just going to jump right in. So the first question I'm going to pose, and I'm going to start with Hannah, is like, if we can just rewind to March 2020, which for me seems like 10 years ago, but it was only 2 years ago. Hard to believe. How did you feel when the pandemic first reached Newfoundland and Labrador and everything was kind of coming towards our province? We could see it in the media. I remember sports teams were like, everything was stopped. But how did you feel, and what were kind of some of your initial reactions when the pandemic first hit us?
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Hannah, just to give a little introduction. Yeah, so when I think back to March 2020, it does feel like forever ago. And I want to acknowledge that my experience isn't going to be the same as everybody else's. So, we're all in different circumstances. So what I say doesn't have to resonate with anybody else, but I do know that when the pandemic first hit, I did not know a lot about it. So to me, it kind of just felt like, oh, maybe a little break from school or a little, break from work. And I wasn't thinking it was going to get as severe as it is. And, I just felt like it was going to be 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I had no idea how long this was going to be and how much it was going to affect the people around us. And I think when it started to get more severe, I think I really realized how much of an impact this was going to have on us as students and everyone in general. And I definitely started to feel really overwhelmed and scared. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can resonate with those feelings of just there was so much unknown, right? And I think it's even hard to imagine now where we didn't have a vaccine and there was really no understanding of how to treat this and how severe it was. And you were kind of hearing all these horror stories. So I definitely feel that anxiety and kind of not even really knowing how, the extent in which it would impact us. Rebecca, maybe I can go over to you, just kind of going back to March 2020, what were some of your initial thoughts, reactions? How did you see it impact your life kind of back in winter of 2020?
I definitely agree with Hannah that I definitely didn't think the pandemic was going to be this serious. Um, at first, I kept seeing videos, obviously online of other places in the world and how bad it was getting in other places compared to here, and it just never even crossed my mind that it would be to the extent of where it is right now. One area of my life that it's really impacted is my job. So right now I'm working at an after school program, but so before that I was working at a bridal salon. So obviously since when the pandemic hit, people weren't having weddings and stuff or buying wedding dresses. So I kind of lost my job and had to try and search for other work. And then even when they kind of asked me to come back, but I wasn't really given any hours or anything because we were kind of almost going out of business. So I feel honestly the pandemic has really negatively affected a lot of small businesses here in Newfoundland. Another thing that I like thought about was before the pandemic started, like I found like my friend group was like a lot closer than it is now. And I feel like the reason for that is because like we obviously could spend a lot of time together and stuff before we had to obviously like go into lockdown. And when lockdown hit, and since there were so many lockdowns over the past 2 years, um, I only really was able to see people like in my like bubble, which was basically only my family. So I feel like I kind of like the relationship with my friends has kind of like changed a lot in like a negative way.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that that's such an important point, right? And one we don't talk about a lot is like the effect of going in and out of lockdown. And then like I remember when the first lockdown hit and being like, now which part of my family is going to be in my bubble? And like, who are like my like 1 to 2 friends that can be in my bubble? And those are really like weird decisions to have to make. And it's difficult for friendships, I think, especially when you have like a group of friends that you typically hang out with, when all of a sudden it's like you're kind of choosing who you most want to spend time with,
Yeah.
which is really, really difficult for sure. I can see, I definitely felt like the social impacts of the past couple of years as well. Sarah, perhaps I can go over to you. I'm just reflecting on that question of like, what were some of the areas of your life that were impacted by the pandemic? What kind of comes to mind for you?
So I think a lot of what Rebecca was saying, I can understand, but for me, it was the opposite. So my family's actually in Clarenville. And with school and everything, like I do try to get out once a month or so for a weekend to visit. But when the pandemic hit, I really had to weigh the option of like, okay, am I going to be isolated for the majority of my time so that I can see my family on the weekend, or am I going to just not have them in the bubble and choose my friends? So that is ultimately what me and my partner decided to do. But it was kind of sad because, those weekends that I did want to go home, I couldn't just out of safety reasons. So there was a lot of months that, Easter came around that April and my mom like dropped us off turkey dinner on the doorstep and like we couldn't see her. So like I feel like it was kind of the opposite. I did spend a lot of time with my close friends, so that was great, but it was sad to like see her in my driveway and not be able to go over and hug her and stuff. Um, I also got a puppy during like just before we went into lockdown for the first time, and obviously like my family wanted to meet him and everything, but like we couldn't. So yeah, I think it was the opposite for me in that fact. It was really sad not to be able to see my family. um, and I think work, I was also really impacted with work. So I work with kids with disabilities, so mostly autism, and I think I was just so hyper aware of the fact that they were more at risk. So I really just wanted to be careful, and every little sniffle that maybe it wasn't COVID, but like I was just so hyper aware of everything going on that I didn't want to like. I just ended up taking some time off if I had a symptom, just because you can never be too sure. So even waiting for those test results to come back, I missed like several weeks of work to make sure that they were safe, and that definitely had a financial impact on my life. So yeah, I think there was definitely some difficulties in those first few months when we didn't really know what was happening or really much about COVID-19 in general.
Definitely. It's interesting because both you and Rebecca have mentioned like the impact on work, right? Rebecca's kind of highlighted how the pandemic had adverse effects on small businesses and what did that mean as like as a staff member. And then you're highlighting what happens when you have to go into isolation because you're experiencing symptoms. And I know that that's been such a like widely held experience, especially for young workers, right? Who are like maybe working in service industry, or in like healthcare and support industries, where you have to kind of take that time, and sometimes or often it's unpaid leave, right? That you have to take off. I'm wondering, just on that theme, Hannah and Bridgette, did either of you find that your work was impacted at all during the pandemic?
Yeah, so actually the same thing pretty much happened to me. I work a retail job, but I also work with youth. So I'm at a youth center in Harbor Grace. So I actually couldn't continue working my retail job because they only allowed managers at that time. So, and the youth center, of course, shut down for safety precautions. So I also lost any income that I was getting. So that was definitely really difficult for me. And both of my family members, so my aunt and my uncle, they were needed. So they're both in like high careers that needed to still go to work. And actually, I ended up having to babysit my two little cousins. So I was with them all the time. So they were pretty much my bubble. And it was scary for me because they're so small. And I was always worried about me bringing COVID into their house because I was there with them all day long while their parents were out working as well. So, that was really scary for me. And to think about the fact that I could possibly bring COVID to them, and I wasn't able to see anybody, any family or any like friends. So that was definitely hard on me as well. But I think what got me through was spending the time with my little cousins and just knowing that, we're going to get through it, and it might be hard right now, but, at least I got them to see every day.
For sure. Yeah, that's interesting, Hannah. Like you're kind of speaking to that like caregiving role, right? Which really shifted over the past, and I think it's still shifted, right? For folks who are maybe home, working from home and have kids at home, whereas before there would be that separation. So I think that's such an important point, is like kind of how those caregiving roles have changed over the last couple of years. Bridgette, over to you. Did you find did you find the pandemic kind of influenced or affected your work at all, or even like some of your maybe career related goals?
Yeah, so with regards to my work and my employment, so I work in the food service industry. And that, of course, as we know, like many restaurant businesses were closed down for a very long period of time. And there was also a period of like ups and downs there as well. So I've seen the entirety of that. And with regards to like my school and my long-term goals as like a social work student and a social worker, I know I have friends in other faculties who have experienced a lot of difficulty with like placements and, this work from home, like virtual, and that really gives a different experience for a lot of students, especially when you're thinking about your future career. So I had friends who didn't get to have those in-person placements and were doing them from home. And like personally, I feel like that makes a big difference. Just in terms of like environment and relations and stuff. So I think that there definitely is a big impact there.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that's such an important point, right? There's like these disruptions that happen that are actually just so important for charting the course of like the rest of your career. Like not getting the internship or the work term could then influence where you do or do not land in terms of a more permanent work opportunity. So I think that that's such an important point. I'm going to just actually stick with you, Bridgette, for a moment, because I'm kind of curious now about like, we've talked a little bit about, our experiences over the last couple of years as it's related to our jobs, family, bubbles, the social dimensions of it, feelings of anxiety and mental health for sure. But I'd love your thoughts, Bridgette, on kind of what do you see as some of the long-term impacts of the pandemic? Are there what are some of the long-term, perhaps negative outcomes, but then are there any positive shifts that you think are going to come out of the last couple of years?
So as an individual who does not do overly well with virtual sittings, and I'm very social, like I love social interaction, like I love interacting with my friends, my coworkers, like I do really well in those situations. So I think that like having people at home in a virtual setting for a long period of time has definitely taken that away, like that relation, that coworker relationship. So I think that could definitely be a long-term impact in a negative way, because you're just not used to those surroundings. You're not used to, I guess, being in social situations anymore. I personally know that has impacted me, like not being familiar with those situations any longer in my workplace and in school and in classrooms, but also in a way that has kind of been positive as well, because people are very adaptable in their roles. So if you, like, I know a friend of mine is a nurse, and she's had to do so many different things in her role as a nurse, like from the pandemic. So I feel like that can definitely positively impact your role in whatever that may be, because you just learned how to navigate and how to find different ways of doing things.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? Like it's so like anxiety inducing, but also in a way you're kind of forced to, I think all of us have been forced to adapt, like whether we like it or not. And I guess in some ways that does kind of, especially as a young professional or someone who's just entering your career, it maybe equips you with skills and expertise that you perhaps wouldn't have otherwise had, because you're just kind of forced to perhaps take on a bigger scope than you normally would. So yeah, that's a really good point, Bridgette. Hannah, maybe I'll go over to you, like just kind of reflecting on the long-term impacts of the pandemic. What are you anticipating as a student, as somebody who's kind of now going to be soon moving into their career as a social worker?
Yeah, so one of the big things that I think about is like the negative impact on like mental health for like younger generations and even older generations. I know that for me personally, sometimes I thrive actually under circumstances where I'm pushed into something I'm not familiar with, or if I'm not used to it. And there's a lot of people that don't work that way. So being pushed into these virtual, just like Bridgette said, it can be scary, and a lot of people can adapt, but then there are people who can't, as well as there's a lot of unequal opportunities now as well for like students and working professionals. Like, some people may not be able to come to work because they have family at home who, if they catch COVID, like it could be dangerous. So like then they're missing out on that job opportunity or whatever it may be. So I think that that's definitely going to be a long-term effect. And when I think of things virtual as well, I also have a little bit of a different perspective on that, because I do know that although it's been negative for a lot of people, I think it's been positive as well, especially when it comes to mental health and anxiety. Some people don't do great in like settings like in person, and I think virtual gave them a chance to ease into that. They were, you could choose if you wanted your camera on or not at times, and you were able to be in the comfort of your home as well. So I think that really helped people who suffered with anxiety and depression and things, because if you just couldn't get up for the day and you just didn't want to leave your house, you had that opportunity to log in online, and you were able to still get things done if you had to. So I think there's some positive and there's some negative as well. I think it really depends on your personal situation and experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think a really good reminder that like we don't all experience things in the same way, right? And virtual for some people is great, and for others it's torture, and vice versa, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important point to highlight, is like, what does it mean? What has the pandemic meant for accessibility and inclusion in learning and employment environments? And Sarah, maybe I'll go to you now. I'm just reflecting on that question of like, how has the pandemic affected your future goals, right? Has it shifted things, or has it made you look at things in a different way, or maybe derailed things in a different way? What are your thoughts on that question of kind of how it's impacted your future goals?
I think in a lot of ways, it's made me really admire the profession of social work, because social work is not something that you can just stop doing. Like, I know a lot of people during the pandemic were able to take time off and work from home, but like social workers were on the front line. They still had to be going out into the community in vulnerable situations themselves. And I think it has really inspired me, their ability to adapt and do the work that they do. So I think in terms of like my long-term goals, I feel like it definitely secured that passion for me. Like, this is where I want to be. These are the people that I admire. But I think in terms of our education, there's a couple social work students, or the class ahead of us actually, they've never stepped foot into the social work building. They've never met the people who are teaching us or the people on staff there in person. And now that I have the opportunity to do so, I think even though that there's virtual meetings and that there's virtual classes, I think that personal connection of in person is like a really important part of our education. So it really makes me reflect on how that is impacting them as a class, even though it's not a personal thing for me. And I can understand how they feel that they're missing opportunities to get like learning opportunities, because a lot of our school is discussion based. So those discussions definitely are impacted when it's through WebEx or Zoom or those types of online forums.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I think like we've put such like a big focus on digital in the past 2 years, and now we're almost hearing that it's like we actually want to like lean away from digital a little bit, because I think a lot of people are really tired of sitting online all day. But there's also the digital inclusion dimension, right? And when we have been in conversation with our partners across the province, this is one of the biggest and loudest themes that we hear is, number one, like being online means having reliable Wi-Fi or data or a device that's reliable, which not everybody has. And then the other side of it is like the privacy component. We've heard a lot from young people who are part of gay straight alliances in the school system, for example, which have moved online, and that's great. But if you're not out in your home, then that could be a really dangerous position to be in. And that, absolutely limits the accessibility for those folks who need supports. So I think I'm reminded through this conversation of, digital it's a great thing in some ways, but also really limiting in others, and really the need for that blended approach, at least as we kind of move out of the pandemic. So my final question to you folks is my favorite question, which is, you folks you're change makers, you're engaged in the social work profession because you want to make a difference. And so kind of reflecting on the recommendations that you folks have reviewed in this policy brief that's been co-created with a bunch of agencies across the province, I'd love for your insight on kind of what would you like to see provincial or federal decision makers consider as we build a better future for young people through COVID-19. So as we kind of see our way through this, hopefully, what are some of the policy interventions that you'd really like to see the provincial or federal government consider? And I'll go to Rebecca first on this one.
I feel like that the provincial and federal decision makers really need to consider how much the last few years of the pandemic has had an effect on youth's mental health. As I mentioned before, like I work in an after school program with like ages 5 to like up until like high school, because we do night programs as well. And before we went into lockdowns, and then once we came back from lockdowns, like kids were completely different. Like I feel like being locked up in your house, like having to do everything virtual, not being able to like hang with your friends or like be in like a school setting or doing like extracurricular activities or anything like that, has really had like a negative impact on their mental health. And I feel like we need to like really look at that before building like a better future for youth following this pandemic. I feel like that's like the most important thing.
Yeah, I think that's so critical, right? And I think that we've heard so much about the way that mental health has been impacted throughout the past couple of years, but we don't just like rebound from that. Like it's a lot of those problems and the reasons and the causes for mental health challenges are still there. Poverty and homelessness and challenges accessing supports, like all of those pieces were there before the pandemic. They've been compounded during the pandemic. And then for young people who are kind of coming out the other side of it, they're still experiencing those challenges, often in an even more heightened way. So I think absolutely that prioritization on mental health supports is going to be so critical as we kind of see our way through this and start to be able to think about like charting a future for ourselves. So yeah, fantastic answer. Bridgette, perhaps I'll go to you. Did you like just thinking on this question of like, what if you had a magic wand and you could kind of influence the way that provincial and federal decision makers act as we emerge from all of this? What would you like to see?
Just going off of what both you and Rebecca said as well, I think just not assuming that things are going to go just like make a switch, just go back. I think like just understanding that it's a process, like things take time. So when we think of like the mental health of youth and of everyone, that's not something that's just going to switch. It's just not going to go away. So I think in terms of like provincial and federal like decision makers and that side of things, I think just advocating is so important, and just hearing their voices. I think just really taking into account what the youth have to say themselves. What are they feeling like? As a youth myself and a young person, like I think it's important just to have our voices heard and just to take into account what are we feeling, just like firsthand, I guess, right from what people have to say and what youth have to say.
Yeah, absolutely, Bridgette. And we are so grateful that you folks have taken the time to share your voices with us today. And we've been so lucky to work with you folks over the last semester as part of your second year social work course. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit with us and generously sharing your perspectives on how COVID-19 has impacted young people and students. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, folks, so that clues up this this brief interview with some wonderful social work students. And if you are interested in learning more about the policy brief on the effects of COVID-19 on young people, you can visit choicesforyouth.ca to learn more. Thanks so much and have a great day.